Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 50 podcast. If you've been with us before, thanks for coming back. We really appreciate it. If this is the first time checking us out, Randy Shrewsberry and I, we co-host the podcast. We're both former police officers, but we kind of have a perspective that you might not be accustomed to when you're hearing from law enforcement or former law enforcement. We're somewhat critical of the institution. And what we try to do on the podcast is have an ongoing conversation about the criminal justice system reform that's taking place in the country and the people who are behind that change. So we'll talk with each other, with authors, activists, academics, practitioners, and people who've been subject to the criminal justice system, people whose lives have been impacted by it. And all of these conversations, we try to have a focus on, what are the problems that we're facing and how can we make change for the better, change things for the better. So in this episode, Randy and I are going to have a conversation. We talk about defunding the police. We try to flesh out, what that really means and what type of harm reduction will need to take place if there is a movement to reallocate resources from law enforcement to other forms of social services or interventions that don't involve the police. What type of harm reduction process will need to take place to make that as smooth a transition as possible. And we also talk about the role that fear plays in police training. So we have a conversation about that as well. So if you find these podcasts useful, the best way to help us out is to follow, like, subscribe, share on whatever platform you're listening to this or watching it on. And then if you could leave a comment, engage with us somehow, hit us up on social media or write a review on your platform, that would all those things would be greatly appreciated. So without any further ado, sit back and enjoy. Thank you. So welcome back, Randy. Today, I just I want to talk a little bit about training solutions and what training is going to look like in the future. And I know that people have been talking a lot about defunding the police and moving on from policing. And through some of our conversations, we've talked about this idea of harm reduction, that there's going to be some type of institution in place that enacts and carries out some type of policing action, and that has impacts on real people's lives. So moving forward, we want to create an apparatus that is as kind and compassionate and creates as little harm as possible. Can you talk a little bit about that idea, like the harm reduction principle we've been talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things, as we talk about defunding the police, or even those, who are even a little bit to the left of that and talk about abolishment, I think that these, on some levels, there's some really, really strong goals to work towards, but this is going to take a lot of time, and so abolishment. As I think about abolishment, I look at there's 18,000 agencies in the United States, half of which, so 9,000 of those agencies, are 10 people or less in the department. So they're really small agencies. And I do believe that there's probably a fairly significant number of those that, it is not necessary for that municipality, or could be absorbed by like either state police or the sheriff's office. But when we look at like major departments, like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, St. Louis, is that working towards this goal of redefining what police have or what role police have in our society, I think is absolutely critical. But to your earlier point is that doesn't mean there's going to be nothing left behind. But the question then becomes is what role do we want the police to have? What do we want their function to be day to day? So in my view, there's a couple of things that related to defunding the police or reallocating of budgeting that can be focused on. Number one is crime solving. So, I always laugh and say, my dad used to always tell me, don't go for seconds until, you've cleaned off your plate, right? And I kind of think about that relative to the police is why are you out searching for other crimes, doing this quote unquote proactive policing, when there are such significant numbers of unsolved violent crimes that aren't getting any attention paid at all. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that police departments aren't budgeted to have strong investigative divisions. So usually anywhere from 7 to 15% of a police department's budget goes to the detective bureaus. So obviously we need to increase that. But the other issue is that what are police trained to do relative to crime solving? And I know we'll talk a little bit more about this in our conversations, but understanding that when we look at school, when we look at programs that the police departments or the state is issuing for officers to be trained in relative to investigations, these are all either a 1-day class, a 3-day class, a week long, or 2 weeks long. In fact, at the Institute for Criminal Justice Training and Reform, we reviewed California's advanced training. This is where detectives go, to learn about specialized investigations. They have about 1,000, just a little bit over 1,000 unique programs that they offer. Most of which, again, are investigative related. There was one program that was more than 2 weeks long, and that was SWAT training. So when you think about homicide investigations, sexual assault investigations, robbery, burglary, all these type 1 crimes, is that we're starting with a staff that really has just had very, very minimal training whatsoever. And so when we have a lack of a budget relative to investigations, when we have lack of training, then we see results such as 500,000 unsolved homicides in the United States. There's 25,000 here in Los Angeles County. Chicago Police Department recently reported that they solved less than 5% of sexual assault cases. Which in my view then just really defies the role that we've all kind of come to agree that police are going to have in our society. We've accepted a lot of these other things. In fact, we've probably put an undue burden on them.
Yeah, we have them doing things that interfere with those objectives. Like when I think of the police, the fundamental overriding goal should be for them to the number one thing should be investigating homicides. It's the most severe, important crime. It's something everyone in our society can agree with, that we don't want people going around and murdering people, and we need some type of units in place, some institution in place to investigate those and prevent it from happening. But we do a really crappy job of it, and while we're failing at it, we're giving the police more and more responsibilities and things to investigate and activities to carry out, respond to mental health care calls, respond to all of these different traffic control, to drug war, when we can't solve homicides.
Right. And to me is that when I see the police and doing functions that like traffic or quality of life policing, like relative to homelessness, or I think what an enormous slap in the face to each of the victims, right? Because every single one of these homicides, which by the way, unsolved homicides are disproportionately Black and brown folks again. So this is once again, it's not all equal about whose crimes are being solved and who aren't. But when I see the police involving themselves in these kind of, just petty enforcement or kind of like busy work almost, I think, there are husbands and wives and mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and friends and cousins and who've lost someone right there. I mean, there's somebody dead, and the police are seemingly saying, "Yep, we don't know who did it, and we don't have time to figure it out." Well, why don't you have time? Right. So I live not in downtown LA, but just a few miles outside of LA, and it's relatively urban. And I remember a year or two ago coming outside of my building, and there, we have an enormous homeless problem in Los Angeles. And I came out of my building, and there was seven police officers that were dealing with a guy to tear down a tent that he had built on the sidewalk. And immediately I thought, holy cow. I mean, they were there probably an hour, and I was like, just add up what that cost.
Hmm.
And all the while, these homicides aren't being solved. All the while, and I would take another step forward, and I agree with you that I think that homicides is the number one critical job. If you have unsolved homicides, with a few exceptions, you probably shouldn't be out involving yourself on other ones. But the other really problem is on sexual assault cases. I mean, we have loads and loads of untested rape kits. These kinds of
Hmm.
crimes aren't really followed up in meaningful ways, unfortunately. And then so it then creates this kind of cycle of where victims of sexual assault aren't willing to come
Right.
forward because they're already starting with, what are the police going to do
Hmm.
anyway?
And
Right?
the same thing with homicides is where people lose confidence in the police. So
Yes,
their friend gets robbed or murdered or assaulted, and they don't have trust in the institution to seek out the offender and provide them with some form of justice. So people take things into their own hands, and we've shown over hundreds of years that this vigilante strain in American society that's reinforced by a loss of trust and faith in the institution of policing can lead to increased homicide rates. When you were talking about that, I just, it was vivid in my mind. I was on a squad when I was a police officer, and for people just tuning in for the first time, Randy and I are both former police officers, and I remember being on a squad where there were two officers assigned to handling a different type of investigation in this precinct. So we had two guys that worked dope cases. We had two gang guys. We had me and my partner were burglary guys. And then we had, it doesn't matter. We all had our responsibilities. And then when one of us had an investigation, if we had a search warrant or surveillance, we required surveillance, we would all come together and work on that investigation together.
right,
And I remember having cases, like legitimate cases of people who've broken into 20 different homes where we were trying to stop a burglary ring, and being called on dope case after dope case. Or the vendors, we had people who migrant workers from Mexico who would have ice cream vendors. So they would have bicycles with the vending, and they would sell food, ice cream, things like this in the neighborhood. And the businesses in the community were putting pressure on the police department to clean up the vending and stop it, this sort of like a facility, because it's interfering with their business. So you have these detectives who are supposed to be investigating. We had two guys investigating robberies. We have two guys investigating gang activity, two guys investigating burglaries, and all kinds of cases that need to be solved, and leads,
right.
ongoing investigations that were being neglected because the priorities of the department were to satisfy certain people with certain interests and maybe some power, businesses of power. So
That's right.
it's not always just the police not wanting to focus on it. It's these, sometimes it's external pressures that are being exerted on the police department to focus their attention on homelessness or some other problem.
Sure, and I agree with that. And but I do hold account that the
Yeah,
administrations that allowed
sure.
this to go on here in Los Angeles. In fact, the West Bureau, which is a more affluent part of Los Angeles. They certainly don't have the same levels of crime like South Central or something, but they still have plenty. Um, but but I learned recently that they were setting up bicycle decoys and then a camera, and so then you have somebody who is tasked to take that bicycle out there, to chain it up, then someone to watch it, to do a surveillance on a bicycle, or someone to review footage. Then invariably somebody is going to come up and steal it, and then then you've got to track that person down. There's record keeping that is, with reporting and to the crime analyst. Over what? Over $150 bike? It isn't to say that, that police doesn't have any role in some of these kinds of smaller things, but when it's become the emphasis,
Right.
again, especially it's become an emphasis at a point, kind of like what you're talking about, when there's burglary rings that are, that are just given up. I think that you made a really good point earlier is about, a part of this issue as well is about the relationship that the police have with the communities. And this breakdown, this relationship breakdown, then discourages people to come forward and say, "Hey, I know who robbed the liquor store, or I know who shot Billy," because when the relationship is so deteriorated, then they view the enemy, or the police as an enemy, while simultaneously wanting justice, for whatever wrongdoing that happened in their community. And I think that when we talk about defunding the police, I think that, or envisioning what that role would be, I think that if we step away from heavy enforcement on the drug war, as an example, or this proactive style fishing expeditions or stop and frisk, those kinds of things. Even just removing some of that, then I think is a pathway for people to start, looking at, that the police are responding to incidents, and not just out trying to, find some things on their own.
And the police and the police detectives have far less to do with successful prosecution. And we can it's a whole other conversation about the prosecution end. I'm just talking about
Sure.
solving a crime, identifying a person, and then turning it over to some other entity to resolve it. Getting to that point is far less dependent on the work of police officers and police detectives, I would argue. And I think the literature supports this, than it is on the citizenry. No, there is no such thing as a successful police investigation without the cooperation of witnesses, of victims, and not just them talking to you, but them taking an active role in helping you solve a crime. So if you're conducting a homicide investigation, I had a chance to work on several homicide investigations when I was a police officer, and the having a victim's family members, witnesses who view you as legitimate and feel as though you're acting as a fair arbiter and wanting to help you do your job, versus witnesses and victims' families who view you as in an adversarial nature and don't trust you and think that you're going to catch them up on something else, are two completely different ball games. It's almost impossible without cooperation.
I totally agree, and I actually share a story, if you'll humor me for a moment, just anecdotally, about how this kind of can play out. Is that early in my career, the municipality that I had was pretty small, or I worked at was pretty small. And we had a homicide at a convenience store in the middle of the night. A young woman was shot execution style twice in the back of the head, with a .25 semi-automatic weapon. There at that time there weren't cameras, so we didn't have footage. I mean, this is 30 years ago, and a little bit of it was a whodunit. However, we pretty early on had identified her boyfriend, or estranged boyfriend, as the likely suspect. Most violent crime is someone that of course. But we had learned early on that they were having some problems. She was breaking up with them, but we didn't have a murder weapon. He wasn't talking. We didn't really have a strong amount of evidence. And so while we knew that it was likely him, and I was just a patrolman at this time, is that we weren't really getting anywhere in our investigation. And about 2 months in, I was, just coming onto my regular shift, and the dispatcher says, go to the station and meet with, someone who's requesting to speak with you personally. And so I went there, walked up to there's a guy standing outside, and he said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "No, I don't, because you meet so many different people, but they remember you." And he had, and that's what he said, is he said, "I remember you." And he said, "I have some information for you about this homicide." But before he gave me the information, he told me the reason why, and that he was coming forth. And that was because the year previous, I had stopped him for a license plate violation. He had taken the tags off of one of his cars and put it on another and was driving around with it. In Ohio, that's called fictitious plates. And you typically, it's a pretty heavy fine. You tow their car and so on and so forth. And for whatever reason, I just wrote him for expired tag, I think, or maybe improper replacement of license plate, and told him, get the car home and, get this squared away.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't to say that I didn't do this, or I did it this way on every single case. There were lots of cars that I stopped, but just in this instance, for whatever reason, I didn't. And that left an enormous impact on him, to which he felt like there's somebody I can trust. There's somebody, that's just not out on a big power trip, or, that is genuinely trying to look, at every angle when somebody does something wrong. And so he was able to tell us that the gun, the 25 that was stolen, or that was used, was stolen from the boyfriend's grandparents. He was able to tell us where the gun was now, which was at the bottom of a pond. He was able to testify about statements that the boyfriend had made. And that case was solved, and I think the guy took a plea, and didn't go to trial, but off he went. And I always, I didn't have a lot of those kinds of circumstances over the years, but that really impacted me, because I thought that right there is just the power of relationships, right? Is that when the community does trust you. And is this always going to be the case? No, of course not. But if I live in an area for which I already feel like, I'm being treated differently than the rest of the communities of my city, and I'm being hassled riding a bicycle on the wrong side of the street, in a residential neighborhood at 2 a.m, and the cops are stopping me for it, kind of like what happened here in Los Angeles with Kizzy, who was killed. Really? I'm not, you don't have anything else. I mean, you want me to trust what I tell you, when you're busting people for weed or whatever it may be.
And it's not just the implication of not solving the crime and a further erosion of trust. There are real world implications. So like if you're, in your case, just hypothetically speaking, if those people who lost a loved one thought they knew who it was, and they didn't have they weren't in the criminal justice system, were not able to intervene and solve the crime and provide some sort of punishment or whatever it's going to look like. I don't know.
Right.
Then those people still may feel a desire to seek justice on their own.
That's right.
And I think in a lot of these cities where we've seen these homicide rate spikes recently, and when you look in past epochs of American history and British and English history, when the trust in the government goes down, you see more of this, people taking matters into their own hands.
Sure.
Because you still need to live in these neighborhoods. So if you feel as though you or your family has been victimized and violently, then the act of retaliation through the use of violence is a form of self-protection. You feel as though you're protecting yourself. So it becomes this very vicious cycle of low-level violence.
Well, and I would just add a third element to this, which is crime prevention, and is if I see someone suspicious, or if I see hear like some arguing or something that sounds like it could be escalated, if I have a strong relationship with the police to actually come in and take care of the problem, not escalate it, then I would feel more comfortable. But I think that there are large segments of the population now who may see things even before they happened, and we're like, ugh, you know, if I call the police, it might make a bad situation even
Right.
worse.
That's why we see the crime data of reported crimes versus survey data. There's a lot more crime that is
Right.
reported to the. So let me ask you this: when you were becoming a police officer, getting your training, and throughout your career, did you receive any sort of formal training from your police department or police academy about the role of vigilantism and trust, and the why it's important to build trust, and ways to do it, and were you taught how to do that?
Well, not in any meaningful way. There was always kind of this introduction, and for those of you who have listened before, I attended academies in 3 different states, and so each of those I was really able to kind of evaluate, like, if it was different from one geography to the other. And one of the really primary similarities was is that usually the first or second day, you would get a little bit of, a few hours on the history of policing, a little bit on ethics. There might be a little bit on community relationships, but probably not more than a day. And in those areas, they might touch on things like vigilantism, or the importance of community relationships. But my experience more was is that, even though, they may have kind of covered these things very, in a very cursory way, is that the training academies so often are built around being adversarial,
Mm-hmm.
or viewing others as adversarial. And so the two can't coexist. You can't say simultaneously, like, hey, it's really, really important for you to have a strong relationship with the community, and they're the enemy,
Right.
right? I mean, as my dad used to say, that dog doesn't hunt. That just doesn't work. And so, and the other thing is, I think that because it's so minimal, that it's easily just to be dismissed. Los
Right.
Angeles now, has done better. They now, inside their academy and basic training, I heard Chief Moore speaking about this recently, talking about kind of the historical relationships, kind of, starting, with the Watts riots to Rampart corruption and Rodney King, all of these things, in a hope to have officers at least identify why it is that there is this broken trust. The problem that I have with this is that, while that's better than nothing for sure, is that it continues to speak about these ills as if it was long in the past, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that because of the war on drugs, because of this excessive quality of life policing, and misguided away from investigations, or crime prevention, is that we're again just kind of caught into this same cycle that we're never really going to escape unless we take a major change. In your department,
So I
did
think my training took place after yours. So I think things have gotten a little bit better. So we got
mhm,
some exposure. We talked about it. We got the acronyms, but it was all very brief. It was at the academy. It wasn't prescient. It wasn't something that was being reinforced as I was interacting with the community. So
sure.
I would say there was an attempt made, but it was pretty superficial and not very successful. Deeper into my career, I encountered uh, mostly like detectives and who and law and some people in patrol who understood those things and had learned them over time, and made it part of their work to share it with people that they mentored on the job. So I encountered lots of people who understood that, and they were really much more successful. I found the people who understood those things.
Well, and my indictment of police training, and a great deal is a lack of nuance. A police officer is not taught about these kinds of things, about what can be the results of poor relationships. We didn't study the complexities of criminality, right? What role does poverty in education play, or addiction? Um, we didn't look at, and again, I mean, I think it's getting a little better. At least it's being touched on, but we didn't really meaningfully look at how segments of our population is treated different, especially surrounding race or socioeconomic statuses. And I think had I been an officer and been able to kind of walk in understanding that this is way more than good guy versus bad guy, right? Is that this oversimplification? It really just it helps no one, in my view.
There's a term I've been using. I stole it from somebody from a book, but it's this idea of the sociological imagination,
Yes.
about looking at a set of circumstances in the world and understanding that there's a complex set of individuals, institutions, all of these things come together to create an environment where people are going to behave in particular ways. And I agree. If police officers had a fundamental understanding of that, and if that type of thinking were nurtured going into the job and then throughout their career, that would be a positive outcome. My question would be, do you feel as though that the current structure of the way police are trained, so like a police run a police academy, and then you're trained on do you feel as though that there needs to be a decoupling in that initial training, and perhaps with ongoing training where there's some sort of outside institution that has some role in instilling those values?
I think that's the absolute solution to a great deal of these kinds of problems about when we talk about police training. So number one is police just don't have much training, right? And we've all now heard something the organization, the institute, heavily parroted out is that cosmetologists, hairstylists require more training in the police than the police do in every single state in the United States. And then again, this extends to massage therapists, to nurses, to doctors, to lawyers, etc. But even setting that comparison aside, is then the question is that, okay, if on average a police officer is spending about 6 months, a little bit more maybe, in training, what is the breadth of knowledge that a person can get on any topic in 6 or 7 months? Yet alone, the complexities of human behavior and crime and those kinds of things. So I think that number one, as we look for solutions to how do we reshape police? Because one of the things I think is critical to point out is that no matter what we do relative to reform, there's a training component that is tied to that. So if we are talking about ending mass incarceration, there's training tied in how do we do that, or ending the war on drugs, or improved crime solving, or better forensics. So the very first thing we have to do is we have to give the police some breathing room in order to be able to have and the instructors, for them to have enough time. The wall that we run into for this is that because the police academies, largely speaking, are provided by the state or mandated, or I'm sorry, either by the state or by a local jurisdiction, then we come into budgetary issues. So a rightful argument that I see, like on Twitter or online, is that how are you simultaneously asking to defund the police and increase training? Well, the way that we do that is that we remove training away from the municipalities or from the state altogether and put it in higher education, just like every other profession.
Nursing.
Yeah. Well, the better one that I usually use is like if you want to be a prosecutor or a DA or a deputy, DA, the state. I mean, so that's an arm of law enforcement. They're not sending you the state. Los Angeles County isn't sending their attorney or people to become attorneys to work for the DAs. They have to do this on their own. And maybe there's tuition reimbursement. Maybe there's programs for which we make sure that everyone is included so that policing it can be representative. But to place the burden solely on the taxpayer is always going to run up. You're always going to run up against a wall on how far we can expand it. When we look back to like the 1970s to now, policing for the most part only increases about 7 hours a year. That's so really just not at all, right?
Right.
The other thing that I think is important that having training in higher institution is that it provides a greater diversity of who's teaching,
Hmm.
because one of the problems is that in policing very often you find yourself in an echo chamber, and we've talked about before about how close knit the culture of policing is. And that really starts in the academy, right? Because the people who are teaching you are only teaching, or not only, but the vast majority are teaching from a position of experience as a police officer instead of, so then it's kind of this junk in, junk out, right? We're just in the same cycle of they were trained poorly or inefficiently or minimally, whatever it may be, and then they're just passing that along as well. So if we move training away from the state, we can expand it without an additional cost to the taxpayer. We can get a greater diversity of education, and we can drill down into topics, even current topics, that are critically important. And so, the one example that I always give is about the length of time that police officers study law. It's in
Hmm.
their name, law enforcement, right? So you would think a huge bulk of what their training is surrounding law. So for those of you who aren't real familiar, police officers have to learn constitutional law, federal transportation law, state laws, state traffic laws, local ordinances and regulations, and civil liability and torts. And on average, they do that in 60 hours.
Yeah, no
So
problem, right?
less than 2 weeks. Right. I mean, and I'm sure you've seen this if you hadn't done it before, where you're on a traffic stop or you're on a call and you're flipping through a book to find out like what crime may have been committed in this, because you're wanting to
Hmm.
arrest the person or whatever, or hearing other officers cite laws that were just non, that were non-existent.
Yeah, there were
And
certainly lots of people who I encountered where they just didn't have a fundamental understanding of how the law worked.
right. And so when we drill back to that question of why, why is this the case? Part of it is through imbalance of training, right? Because of this overemphasis of tactical training and use of force and those kinds of things. But even in the best of circumstances, right? Yeah, it could be the entire 6 months of law training. I don't think that police officers have to be attorneys, so I reject the idea that they need to study law for 2 or 3 years. But but even if we spent 6 months on it, that's still barely enough.
Hmm.
And so when I think most training academies cover 45 to 50 different topics. That just falls into just one other topic that you're in, and so little emphasis on it.
So one possible sort of version of this might be that I'm interested in a career in law enforcement. I've got my first year of college under my belt with my intro to English and my basic math or whatever, and then I say, I'm going to go ahead and pursue a degree in law enforcement technology at the University of Arkansas.
Yeah.
And it's a 4-year degree. I take a variety of courses like I would with any other sort of degree outside of my discipline, but I would have a focused curriculum that the university has established and that is recognized by the state as a sort of pre-certification requirement. And then after I receive that degree, then I would be eligible for hire and additional training in policies and procedures of a particular department. Is that kind of how it would work?
Yeah, I think that you're describing it perfectly. The question, some of when we look at kind of internationally, who already have these kind of models in place, is that some are in the exact way that you're describing. Some say, okay, you got to knock out a few electives like English or whatever it may be, foreign language, but then the vast bulk of what you're studying is relative directly to the certifications or become eligible. So the question is that, is how long does that take? And when we compare internationally, look, the United States is in the company of Iraq, Afghanistan, Jordan, Papua New Guinea. These are the only other countries that maybe a few more. There's some African countries that have this low of standards. So when we look, like Abu Dhabi as an example, it's 5 years. It takes you 5 years to learn to become a police officer. The Nordic countries, it's 3 or 4 years. Germany, I think, is 3 years. But even as I name like all of these things that have higher standards than we do, like Australia or New Zealand or Canada, is that they don't encounter the violence that we have in our country, right? So they're not investigating homicides at the rate that
Right.
we should be. They're not investigating armed robberies at the rate that we should be. And they still are saying that, even setting those things aside, that it takes 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years, maybe, to become an officer. So our view is that, optimally it would be a 4-year program with the heaviest amount of overwhelming balance of the classes is directly related to the job. While I think that, some extracurricular things are important. But realistically speaking, I think that, as a nation, we would probably first roll out as a 2-year degree, allow it to be an associate's degree, and then, eventually expand it to a 4.
You would think, like any other profession, over as time goes on, you would want the training to grow more intense because there's more. Society becomes more complex. There's new types of crimes. There's new skills that are required. The job should become more technical and require more skill over time. So that would make sense that you would have over an extended period an extending or growth in the training program, which, like you said, if you're only adding 7 hours a year, that's insane. You're definitely not going to keep up.
The NYPD, I don't know if it's still there or not, but NYPD's museum, they have a museum. They had curriculum from dating way back. I think all the way back to either late 60s, early 70s, and then a trend of them year over year or every couple of years. When we looked at those, is that largely speaking, maybe with the exception of like mental illness, some mental illness awareness or implicit bias, it's really the exact same training. It's maybe some more hours of it, but it's the same. A few technologies changed, maybe with radio communication or breathalyzers or intoxicizers, those kinds of things. But for the most part, it's identical, and that's one of the reasons to plug the institute is that which is our mandate is that because this has never been done before. No organization has ever said, okay, what would it look like if we just start from scratch and say, okay, a curriculum should include all of these topics with with a wide variable of instructors or expertise that's teaching them. How often would an individual need to be recertified for these kinds of things? The other thing that we don't teach in the academy that I think that is also important is about leadership. And so Germany, as an example, has basically kind of an ROTC model where, like in the military, if you're in an ROTC program, you come out of your initial training as a supervisor, right? I'm correct with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, you come in as an officer. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the same thing is that Germany has done, and then what this allows is that it allows officers to come in who are leaders and trainers without being tainted by bad habits or bad policies previously. I think one of the most critical thing to understand or to highlight over and over is Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, was a supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, was a field training officer, directly responsible for a couple of the officers that were there that day. Is that we have to have a means for which we break these cycles of this old guard kind of thing. That's just being passed on to agencies. So I think that at minimum we have to be able to explore other models that have seemed to show some success in other areas.
I think that it's a challenge, and one of the reasons it's going to be a challenge is because you're really taking a certain amount of power away from policing, and the academies they're spaces where you replicate the existing culture, where there's tradition, where there's an institutional memory, where people move up in the organization and then return to the academy to replicate themselves and in the institution, and you're decoupling that replication process from policing, and you're putting it outside of the institution, which is it brings different perspectives, different knowledge, types of knowledge, different behaviors into the institution, but at the same time it's a threat to people in power.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing is that it takes a strike at current culture, so militarization, or what internally they call stress training, which is basically how closely are you being trained to, like a soldier, which most academies have at least some militarized training. This blue wall of silence, or the blue code of silence, that's integrated very, very deeply into basic training. So if all of a sudden now, you're saying that the influences of these kinds of decision makings, or what they view their job to be, is less influenced by this internal culture, and it might be some hippie professor at USC, or wherever it may be. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's where there is some resistance. But here's the thing: is that everyone wants more training,
Mm-hmm.
right? The officers themselves say that they want more training. The administration and police departments say they want their officers to have more training. The unions, who are very often the obstacle of a lot of reform, they say they want more training. Where things begin to break apart a little bit is what exactly the training is. But the number one resistance is, well, there's no way that I can, number one, afford to send someone, for 2 years to an academy and pay them while they're there, because larger departments pay their officers while they're in training. Some pay on their own, or have to pay overtime or extra staffing to cover. But I would argue that the offset becomes a lower reduction of liability. So we see police officers, getting sued over and over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
That money isn't coming out of thin air, and all of those funds can be used. Well, I don't even think all of them would need to be used, but to be able to afford, looking at different models, which then in turn would reduce misconduct or excessive use of force cases, and be a cost saver.
I wanted to shift it up a little bit and talk about some of the things that are present now in the training. So like one of the reasons that you want to move away from having these training centers that are run by the police is to change the culture. And one of the things we've talked about that's present in the culture right now is like a culture of fear, like an intense level of fear in policing. Can you talk a little bit about what describe what it is and maybe what impact it has on policing and the police and the community?
Sure. So I think that the underlying issue is about militarization that then fosters this fear among police officers, and how that normally works really starts at recruitment. So if you look at recruiting pages, very often it's going to be very, very militaristic. It's going to show officers in fatigues and all this garb, carrying, assault weapons. Maybe even Los Angeles County for the longest time had showing officers rappelling out of helicopters, which was just asinine.
The
right?
videos are pretty. If someone Google recruiting videos for police force, they're kind of funny actually.
Yeah, there are, and I think it's Fort Dick, Arkansas, has a really, really astonishing one, and they're like a department of 12 or 13 people. But but immediately you've decided who you're trying to attract, right? So the police departments today are complaining a lot about issues with recruitment, that sort of thing, or people don't want to be a cop. Well, part of it is because who are you advertising for, and what role are you advertising for? To them about. So then you make it to training academy, and in day one, you're going to see memorabilia or signage on the wall. You're going to be hearing people talking about very simplistic ideas about good versus evil, and you're the good guys, and therefore everyone else is either a bad guy or prone to be a bad guy. So immediately, just with that sentiment,
Or
then
a sheep,
right?
an agentless
Yes,
sort of sheep that needs to be protected because they had no common sense or ability to take care of themselves.
that's absolutely right. But and I would add to say that sheep can immediately as well flip to be a bad guy, or
There's always
part
a
of
wolf
this.
in sheep's clothing, so you
That's
have to be
right.
careful.
Yeah,
Right?
that's absolutely it. So there's a structure in policing, right? People, academies, or the cadets are lining up for inspections. They're marching. They're doing physical training in sync, very, very similar to what you would see in boot camp. And all the while, what's happening is that even before saying a word, is that you are emphasizing that these officers are at war. Um, and so, and then once again, they're the good guys, and then therefore, now we're talking about, yes, the continuation of sheeple, or corrupt opportunists like politicians or lawyers or whatever. But not only are these folks bad, but they're possible enemy combatants, who are at any moment are looking to be able, to take your life, just like what someone would be conditioned to believe as they go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or Yemen, or Syria, wherever the U.S. may be fighting. Then on top of that, then we look at a third of the training. So when we talk about 6 months, a couple of months of that training is solely around how to protect yourself against homicide, how to shoot, how to fight, how to take control of individuals, more physical fitness. All of this overwhelmingly focused on how to protect yourselves from death by homicide. I always kind of share this example to understand that even when we push aside the third of training that's focused on this, is that officer safety or the threat of officer injury or death is interwoven in absolutely every other topic. And so if an officer, as an example, is being taught how to do report writing, and they're in communications, they're learning how, the dynamics of what boxes you fill out, which ones you have to check off, what the narratives sound like. Simultaneously, you're being also told how to stand, to be careful about giving an ink pen, to a bad guy who might, jab you in the neck or jab you in the eye. And then just repeat this over and over and over and over. I will issue this challenge to anyone who's listening. If you want to know what the power of fear-based training and language is that as you get in bed with your partner tonight, just tell them that you saw some spiders at the end of the bed, but now they're gone. And see how well they sleep, right? And then do this over and over and over, day in and day out. So it's of no wonder that that we see such circumstances where officers are acting, out of this idea that they were in danger when most objectionable looks at it would say that they weren't. And if I may, Tom, I talk about this relative to Rayshard Brooks, who was killed in Atlanta. I know you and I have talked about this case as well. Is that for those of you who don't remember, Rayshard Brooks was a man who had passed out or fallen asleep in the parking lot of a Wendy's or in the drive-through. Atlanta Police Department shows. It was Atlanta PD, wasn't it?
Yeah, Atlanta, in a Wendy's parking lot. Yeah.
Yeah, they showed up and felt that he was intoxicated. So they didn't call for him a ride. He said that he was just right down the street from his sister's house. He could have walked, or she could have come and got him. But they had made the decision to make an arrest. And when they did, there was an altercation for which one of the officers lost their taser. And then that officer shot and killed Mr. Brooks. So I highlight two things about this. Is number one is that unequivocally, Mr. Brooks should still be alive today. There was a million other ways that I think that situation should have been handled. But I simultaneously say that the officer, even though he was charged, and I think he was charged because of the current environment of what was going on relative to George Floyd. Had it been a year earlier, I don't think this police officer would have ever seen it. But the officer says that he responded because he was in fear of his life, and the reality is I believe him. Because I think that's what the training and the culture absolutely instills in these officers. But when you think about what would have been required for this person to actually be a threat, for Mr. Brooks to really be a threat, that would have meant that he got a hold of the taser, he shot the officer with the taser someplace where the officer doesn't have protective gear, like a vest. So he's going to have to be a pretty good shot and hit him in the neck or, in the head or something like that, because anywhere else it's probably not going to have a meaningful impact or a meaningful result. But Brooks would have had to shoot the officer with the taser. Or the officer would have had to become incapacitated. Brooks would have had to been able to run up, remove the gun from the officer's holster, and shoot and kill him. All the while, another officer would have been just seemingly standing there, or ran up to the drive-through to order something to eat. I don't know. But it's because the officer, in my view, acted on the possibility of what could have happened. And when we talk about possibility versus probability is endless. It's absolutely endless. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the way that these are evaluated, according to the Supreme Court, the way they should be evaluated is through this reasonable officer standard. And I was in the same boat as you. When I saw this, I thought, well, I wouldn't have shot this guy because there this and this could have, are ways that I would have reacted. I hope. I think I would have. I don't think I would have. I don't think it was reasonable. I don't think it was necessary. But But I also recognize that this reasonable officer, what it is it's something that we need to conjure up in our heads based on our understanding of the type of information that is provided to police officers, the type of training they receive, and their culpable mental state at the time. And I recognize that officers are trained, and it's reinforced that if someone gets your taser, that it's a deadly force encounter. A lot of times that's sort of like the blanket sort of thing you're sort of that you walk away with, and sometimes it's more nuanced, but it's difficult for people to get their head around if you're constantly bombarded with this idea that it's a life or death situation always. And the other thing is that really bothers me is that we've created an institution where we bring people in and we bombard them with fear. Like, okay, this is every traffic stop, you could lose your life. And then we provide them training on how to address those dangers if they encounter them. But quite often we spend a lot of time teaching people useless skills and techniques. Because I also saw a space where, so like with Richard Brooks, where they made a decision to arrest him for DUI. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of good reason for not letting someone go on foot because they could just come back and take their, so they made the decision. We as a democratic society have said driving under the influence is illegal. The police can detain you. And so I don't fault the officers for making the decision to arrest them, but I fault their agency for not providing them with reliable, proven, sound, gentle, because there are gentle ways of taking people into custody that are proven techniques that can be taught but aren't being taught. So we're not only are we instilling these officers with an elevated sense of fear and then training them disproportionately on how to mitigate those risks, but we're training them, I think, the wrong way even when we do train them. So I think it's even worse.
I totally agree. And there's a saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And I think I think that speaks to exactly what your point is that we have this very, very, again, if we walk in with this oversimplified view of the world and of human behavior, then it is been like, well, you should have thought of that before you got arrested, so off to jail you go, without looking at like what are the true impact on this individual and his life. Yes, we all agree that people shouldn't be drinking and driving, but is incarceration always the solution? But to the police it is, right? I mean, it's either let him go or lock him up, and that's it. Look, and I think the other circumstance that's worth speaking about is George Floyd, who was being arrested for suspicion of passing a $20 counterfeit bill. Eric Garner, who was choked to death as well for suspicion of selling loose cigarettes, not paying taxes on a few dollars worth of cigarettes, and so. This again is like where we are, where we're tasking officers to get involved in this kind of just pettiness, and again, do it circle all the way back to the beginning of our conversations. All the while, there's unsolved homicides that are going on that nobody's looking at because you're busy dealing with. Someone selling loose cigarettes. But let's even just take for a moment, because I understand that that the world isn't necessarily not everyone agrees on the kind of these approaches of how much empathy that we should have for individuals who make bad decisions or make mistakes. We could just look at it from a financial standpoint, from an economic standpoint, right? Is this what we want officers to spend their time on? Had they called someone to come get Mr. Brooks, as an example, then the interaction would have been limited just long enough for somebody to show up to pick him up and send him away, scratch him off a summons. Same thing with George Floyd. Is that did he have to go to jail? I mean, I mean, that's a whole other episode. But like, what even proof did they have that he knew that that was a counterfeit bill? But let's say that he did, right? I mean, it was $20 worth. How many? 5 officers, 6 officers. So again, setting aside the point before they kill him. It's just not good economics and resources. So when we talk about defunding and the police are like, oh, well, we're losing our budget, we're losing our budget. Well, I think the examination has to be is what are you spending your budget on? And if I think if that the police were earnestly using their budget fairly, right, to be combating violent crime or solving violent crime or working on crime prevention. I don't think that a lot of people, even those who are to the far left, are going to have as much of an issue about the size of budgeting. But the problem is we just see it kind of being pissed away over and over and over, and then they just ask for more and nothing gets better.
Right. And having worked with some communities in communities with high call volumes and elevated homicide rates, and we've done some survey work and trying to ask people what it is that they want to help make their community safer. It's complicated. It's not just we want the police gone. It's we want the police to be reconfigured and address the things that we're concerned about. Like, they want people who kill people and shoot people to be arrested and detained, but they don't want to have their kid be stopped by the police 3 times on the way home from work in the car, because it's so it's nuanced, it's complicated, it's contentious, it's a challenge, but at the same time, I feel as though right now we're in a unique period in American history where this issue of reimagining what the police can and should be is open for debate, which I think it's the first time in my lifetime that it's been this way.
Well, I'll just add on to that very quickly. Is Gallup just recently published their findings on the nation's push for reform. 94% of Americans said that policing needs to be changed on some level. Some, more than others. But good Lord, 94% of us can't agree on wearing a mask. 94% can't agree on lots and lots of things. So I agree with you. I think we are at a horizon that we can now have these discussions to say what could be next. How do we do this better?
Well, I think we've covered a little bit today, not as much as I wanted to get to, but once we get together, these are such interesting conversations. We could go on for days, but we'll just leave a little bit more for some future episodes. Before we get going, if people are interested in these issues and they want to take part in these reforms, what are some of the ways with the Institute that people can take part?
Sure. So sharing our message either through the podcast, on social media platforms is certainly critical. We are a nonprofit organization that heavily relies on individual donors. So if you go to trainingreform.org, not only can you find all of the resources, especially resources relative to where you may live, but you also have an opportunity to donate. You can select one of the programs that we have actively or generally donate. And we also are driven very heavily through volunteerism. The Institute now has over 100 volunteers all across the globe in a huge wide range of skill sets. So if you go to trainingreform.org and click on ways to help, you'll find both the donate page and the volunteer page, and the instructions on how to follow through with that.
And if you can't donate, you can't volunteer, then I think that it's also really important that we keep this conversation going. So we shouldn't be just talking about this when we have a crisis like we did earlier this summer. It needs to be an ongoing conversation. That's I think one of the primary objectives of this podcast. And if you want to take part in that, continue to listen, like, share, subscribe, fill out a review, and share it across your social media platforms, because the more people hear this, the algorithms will amplify it, and we'll get a greater audience, and the conversation will keep going. So I want to thank you again, Randy, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Thank you, Tom.